What is up, everyone? Jeremy here. Welcome to another video in the tone sample series. In this video, I am going to show you my recipe for creating a crushing metal guitar tone. Alright, so just like any other recipe, there are ingredients, and I want to walk through those now to make sure you've got everything you need to be able to cook up a killer tone following my recipe here. And the first thing is, and most obvious, is you need a guitar. Why do I even bring it up? Well, because I just want to point out the fact that not all guitars are made equal. They have different pickups. There's a lot that can go into putting together a killer tone dependent on your guitar and your pickups. So just a note that you may require some additional tweaking or different tweaking as we get into the video and we're adjusting the gain staging, amp settings, choosing IRs, all of that. So depending on your guitar, things may be slightly different, but this recipe should still work for you. It just requires some additional effort on your part. The next thing is you're going to need at least 1 to 2 good high quality guitar cables. No, not all guitar cables are created equal. If you have old, wicked old or cheap guitar cables, you're not going to get as good of a signal through your signal chain as a high quality cable. So get some high quality cables. All right, next up is an audio interface, and I'm going to start sounding like a broken record here because, surprise, not all audio interfaces are created equal. If you have a cheap and expensive audio interface, expect to have to put in more work to get a good tone than someone who has a higher quality or more expensive audio interface because of the preamps that are built into it. A higher quality preamp is going to give you a better signal, a better tone overall. So just something to keep in mind as we get further into the video. All right, continuing on with our ingredients, the next thing up is an AmpSim. There are tons of AmpSims out there these days. There are some incredible ones: Neural DSP, STL Tones, ML Sound Lab, Plugin Alliance. You can get tons of them all over the place now. So depending on which one you have, as we get into start adjusting the amp settings and choosing IRs, then just keep in mind what you see me doing, you may have to do slightly different. And the next thing in our ingredients list is a good overdrive or boost pedal. So make sure you have one of those. A lot of plugins these days come with one included in the plugin. So just check and make sure if you have one in your plugin. If you don't, you're gonna need one of those. All right, next up, you're gonna need some good high quality impulse responses. Yes, many of the plugins that you get these days come with impulse responses built in. Those are okay for getting started, but if you really want to improve your tone and take your tone to the next level, I highly recommend you look into some good external third-party impulse responses. And the last 2 ingredients you're going to need is an EQ plugin and a compressor plugin, and we'll get into why you'll need those in a little bit. All right, now that we have all of our ingredients, let's go ahead and start cooking up this tone. And we're gonna start with setting up our DI signal and gain staging. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab a guitar and we'll get started. All right, I'm back, and for this, I'm using my Schecter Hellraiser C-7. It has the stock EMG 707 pickups in it. So this is not like a super high-end guitar. These are not super high-end pickups. So I figured this would be a great guitar to use for this demo. And I'm gonna walk through this entire process with you. And the very first thing we're gonna do is, as I mentioned previously, we're gonna set up our gain staging and make sure we have a good DI signal before we ever even think about getting to the AmpSim itself. Now, this starts at your guitar and then goes into the audio interface. So I am going to turn on my volume here. What I'm doing is I'm turning up my volume on the guitar all the way. I've got my tone up all the way as well. And then that goes into my audio interface. And what I'm gonna do here is, my audio interface that I'm using here is my Neural DSP QuadCortex. I also have a Focusrite Scarlett audio interface. Depending on your audio interface, there should be some way for you to be able to monitor your input signal so that you can see how hot or how quiet your signal is coming into the interface so that you can adjust that. Now on the QuadCortex, it's actually somewhat hidden. It took me a little while to figure out how to do this, but on the QuadCortex, if you just slide down from the top of the screen, you get this menu screen here where you can select any of the inputs and outputs and it will give you more information. So I'm going in input 1, so I'm going to select that. And then way over here in this corner, and I apologize for this kind of weird angle of the QuadCortex you're seeing here, It's the best I could do with what I've got handy right now. But way over here in this corner, this is where it's going to show the input signal. And as you can see there, as I strum the guitar, it's showing the input signal. Now, there's a little line that you probably can't see here, closer to like the camera here on this end. And as I play, the audio level moves up towards that line. And if it crosses over that line, that's essentially getting into kind of the red, as you would call it, or kind of near clipping. It's not full on clipping. It's just kind of a warning to say you're getting close to that level of clipping. And it actually shows me the input level as well, so I can watch that and see if it ever crosses over 0. So if it goes into the positive numbers, it's clipping. I got to dial it back. So right now I have the input level. So it starts at 0 right here. And then I had it all the way up to 8.3. That was because of some adjustments I've already made. So I'm going to just double check and make sure that this is still right. All right, so I don't know if you can actually read those numbers there, but it got up to negative 0.5, so about a half a dB away from actually clipping. So, and that was playing pretty hard, and that's where like you really want to play hard on this and make sure you're getting a real hot signal into your audio interface to see if you're clipping at all. Because if you're clipping at all in the interface, you're going to record a clip signal, and that is the worst thing that you could possibly do. So make sure you're dialing in your audio interface to give you a good signal, but it is not clipping. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull this back just a little bit to make sure that I don't get any closer, because 0.5, half a dB is pretty close to clipping. So I landed at positive, increasing the input level here to by about 7.5. It's like 7.7 dB. So that's where I'm at. And that looks pretty good. Looks like it got up to as high as negative 1.7 on that one. So I think I'm okay. All right, so that's setting up your input signal on the QuadCortex and what it looks like, and how to monitor your input signal and make sure you're setting it up correctly to get a good input signal. Now I want to just briefly show you what it looks like on the Focusrite Scarlett so you can see that as well. This is different. You don't get an actual number value. Now they do have software you can run on your computer to actually see what this input signal level is, but they also have a little circular LED light that lights up when you play. And that gives you an idea of what your signal volume is or level. And if it's green, you know you're getting a signal. If it goes yellow, that's getting close to clipping. It's kind of your warning sign. If it turns red, it's clipping. So I'm gonna just go ahead and play here just for a second so you can see what it looks like. And do note that all you're gonna hear is me strumming the strings. You're not gonna hear any audio because I'm not monitoring the Focusrite right now. That's not set up to monitor. It was the QuadCortex. So this is just to give you the visual of what it looks like to set up the Focusrite. So as you can see how it turns green when I play. And then you can see how it's just kind of starting to flash a little bit yellow there. It may actually be turning yellow a little bit more than I typically like it. So I think I would actually bring that level maybe back just a hair, just to ensure that if I play any extra hard or any chugs, really kind of cut through hard, it's not gonna turn red and clip. So that's just a brief look at what it looks like on setting up the input signal on the Focusrite Scarlett. All right, so now my audio interface is dialed in. I've got a good signal going into my interface. Now, from there, it goes into the DAW. So what I'm gonna do here is just quickly monitor my input down here. And let me zoom in on the screen just a little bit here so you can see it a little bit better. All right, there we go. So now what I'm gonna do is the same thing, and I'm just gonna check my input signal. And notice I do have some plugins in this channel strip. They're all turned off. So this is just the input signal, and I've got the level set to 0. So with all that playing pretty hard, it looks like it peaked at negative 1.1. So I can actually maybe just come up a touch on this. I'm just gonna bring it up one little tiny bit, make sure I'm not clipping. So that got to negative 0.7. So I think I'm okay there. I'll continue to monitor it, and if it does ever cross over the red, then I'll dial it back. But it looks like I'm okay because I'm almost negative 1 dB, and so that's a good signal. I've got a good signal coming in now, and it is not clipping. So now the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to engage my EQ plugin. And the plugin that I like to use here is comes with my Slate Digital subscription. It's called Infinity EQ, and I like to use this because it's a parametric style EQ. It gives me this visual of my signal as I play as well. So that's the very first thing I want to do is just kind of take a look at my signal and see what it looks like. And this guitar is actually tuned down to G standard, so it's a fairly low tuning, and it's going to register lower. So I'm going to have a nice deep bassy sound to it. And let me change my screen here so you can actually see what I'm looking at. Okay, here you go. So you can see all that low end, right? Coming through. I get a little tiny bit of high end up above 5K, almost around 10K, but it's all in like the low mids and lows. Now, if I play a little higher, see, I get a little bit more high end coming through. A little bit more mids, but there's still a lot of lows. And then, of course, the other thing I'm watching here is my gain coming in. Notice that I'm hitting at negative 0.83, which is about what I am showing in the DAW channel strip as well. So I'm not clipping anything yet. But if I start to add any EQ in here, if I start doing additive EQ versus subtractive EQ, that's going to push a hotter signal. It's going to cause me to clip, so I'm going to have to watch for that. The very first thing that I know that I always want to do, especially when I'm tuned down so low, is get rid of some of that low end. I can always add low end back later, like from the actual amp itself, the bass setting in the amp. I can increase that, but going into the amp, I want to cut off some of these lows. Now, there have been questions on the channel recently about, why do I keep putting an EQ in front of the amp? Well, I just explained one reason, and that's because I don't want so much low end going into the amp. And then kind of the follow up to that is like, well, why don't I just change the pickups if I don't like the signal coming straight? This is essentially the DI signal. Why don't I change the pickups if I don't like the signal going into the amp? Well, because that feels like overkill to essentially change my entire pickup setup or alter the guitar when I have a tool right here in my toolbox I can use to dial in the DI signal how I like it. So some of you may be thinking, well, that goes against a typical signal chain or a common signal chain or whatever. That I don't care. For me, if I have something in my toolbox that I can use that's going to help me put together the tones and the music that I like and that I want to hear, then I'm going to do that and screw the rules, basically. So I would encourage you to, if you have something in your toolbox that's going to allow you to build a great tone how you want it, then do it. So with that, I'm going to do exactly what I just said. I'm going to cut some of these lows. I'm going to start at about 100 hertz, and then I'm going to kind of taper this off here a little bit. All right, so here we go. I'm at 100 hertz. I've got a pretty good taper kind of cutting off here. This looks more drastic than it really is because the default view in Slate Digital's Infinity EQ is kind of like really zoomed in. So as I start changing things, if it starts to zoom out, which it does automatically, you'll see more of that taper, it'll be more gradual than it actually looks here. But let's just kind of quickly check and see the difference in what this is doing. So here is with this high pass on. And then here's with it off. So you can hear that low end, basically the sub frequencies that is ultimately going to clash with our bass guitar. I mean, it's literally down that far. It's 40 hertz, even 30 hertz that we're registering on here. So I definitely don't want that low because it's just going to clash with the bass. And those low frequencies going into a guitar amp don't sound good. So if you struggle with, if you're struggling with like muddy, like flabby, loose guitar tones that just don't sound good, especially when you got those chugs going on, it's likely because you're pushing too much low end into the amp. So let's start by cutting some of this off. So that sounds pretty good right there. I'm gonna leave that for now. I may actually change it kind of as we get to the amp, but for now I'm gonna leave it. And I'm also noticing, like I mentioned before, there's not a lot of top end happening here. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna boost up some of this upper mids and top end. One of the reasons I do this is because while I was kind of inspecting the frequency response coming out of multiple different overdrive pedals, I noticed that the vast majority of them essentially do what I'm doing right here. They cut the lows and drop the levels in the low mids and then boost the upper mids and the highs. Even if you don't change the tone settings, like that's the default in a lot of these, especially like the Fortin pedals, like the Grind or the 33, those are even far more severe or drastic, I should say, in boosting those highs as well. So that's essentially kind of what I'm doing here, is just kind of somewhat mimicking what some of these pedals already do. So I'm gonna go ahead and just add this upper mid right around 1.5K. I'm gonna boost this up a few dB, spread this out a little bit more, make it a little more narrow, kind of see the frequency spectrum we're working with, and let's see what this sounds like. Yeah, I mean, it's not drastic, but it's there a little bit. Can actually probably come up a little bit more. We're only at 3 dB so far. Okay, now we're gonna get even more severe or drastic, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna really boost up some of these highs. We're at 8 now. Okay, so again, this looks more severe than it really is. Yes, I'm up 8.5 dB on the highs here, but it's really not making like a major difference. It's just bringing some of the clarity into this DI signal. So here's with the EQ off. It immediately notice all that super low end. If you're listening on some good speakers, you're gonna really hear it. And now with it on. All right, so that sounds pretty good to my ear right now. So now we've got a decent EQ'd DI signal. Now the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the stock Logic compressor here, and the reason I'm doing this is because I just wanna make sure I'm taming those low chugs. Those, for anyone who knows, especially when you're playing down low like this, those low chugs can get really woofy really fast. So I just want to make sure I tame those. So I'm not going to do much here. I'm going to go with like the vintage VCA. I don't know. We'll start at like maybe -17 on our threshold. Keep it at 2 to 1. Do no makeup gain, no auto gain. We'll do, I don't know, 0.5, half a knee maybe. We'll do somewhat of a quicker attack, and then maybe 100 milliseconds or so on the release, just to kind of start things out. Turn off auto, turn everything. I don't do anything auto. I like to just dial it in myself. So I'm going to turn all that off, make sure we're not adding any distortion here. Go all 100% mix. And then let's just make sure we've got a good signal coming in and that we're giving a good signal out. Again, gain staging. All right, so it looks like my signal is clipping, as you can see here. And that is likely because of the EQ that I increased all of this additive EQ, and I didn't monitor my gain staging. So let's look. I guarantee you this is clipping. Yep, it is clipping. So again, watch your gain staging right there, how easy it is to miss this. So I'm going to pull back this by a couple dB and see what happens. Let's clear that. Still clipping a little bit there. Pull back a little bit more. Still a little bit. All right, so that's looking pretty good right there. No clipping happening now. So now let's check back in our compressor. That actually looks pretty good. You can see how it's dipping, you know, maybe about 1 dB on right after I hit the chug, and that's where when you let the chug kind of like ring out, that's when it gets that woofy part. It really gets bassy, and I can see that's when it's ducking. So that seems pretty good. Checking my levels, making sure my inputs and my outputs here, setting up the gain staging, make sure this looks good. So it looks actually a little bit soft here. I think I can bring this up maybe just a touch. All right, that looks pretty good. Now let's see. I think it actually clipped for just a bit. Yep, clipping just a touch there. So I'm going to just pull back this a little bit. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, so now that we've got a good signal chain, we've got proper gain staging set up throughout our EQ into our compressor, going into the AmpSim, we're gonna go ahead and start dialing in the settings on the amp. Now, as part of my recipe here for dialing in a good crushing metal guitar tone in the AmpSim, this is obviously going to vary dependent upon which AmpSim you're using. This can vary drastically, in fact, but here are the important concepts that I want to make sure I point out and make sure that this is understood. The signal going into your amp, you want a good boosted signal. This is where the overdrive pedal is gonna come in. I'm gonna turn that on in a second, and I'm gonna use the built-in Fort and Grind here. So you want a good boosted signal to really push a hot signal into your amp. That is going to help tighten up the low end, boost some of the high end to give you some more bite. It is really going to make all the difference for creating a good, tight, chugging, crushing metal tone. The other thing is, keep your gain settings down. Keep them low. Do not fall for the, you know, when people say high gain guitar tone, that does not mean you take the gain and turn it all the way up. That is going to give you a disgusting, muddy, loose, flabby guitar tone. It is not the tone that you're probably looking for. So keep the gain down. And also, a lot of the AmpSims that I've been using, or that I have used rather, I have to keep the bass down as well. Now, if you, depending on what overdrive pedal or boost pedal you're using, you may be able to turn the bass actually up a little bit on the amp, and in fact, that's likely what is going to happen here in this case, and that's because of the Fort and Grind and what it does to the signal. I've actually profiled the signal, sending white noise through the overdrive pedal just to kind of see what frequency response I get and what it does to the overall frequency response to the signal going through the pedal. What it does is it drastically drops off the low mids and lows, cuts them out quite a bit, and then does the exact opposite on the upper mids and the highs especially. It boosts them drastically. So you get an even far more harsh looking EQ curve than what I set up on my DI signal that you saw previously. So because of that, I can actually sometimes boost up the bass a little bit to kind of bring back some of that bass without it sounding like the muddy bass, because I'm cutting the signal going into the amp, so I'm not adding a bunch of distortion to those like sub frequencies and that low mud frequencies. And then in the AmpSim, you can turn up the bass a little bit sometimes with a pedal like this, and it'll bring some of that good low end sound back into your tone. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna probably even just fast forward the video because you don't necessarily need to see me adjusting every single little setting on here because you're probably using a different AmpSim, and even if you're using the exact same one, maybe you want a slightly different tone than what I'm gonna dial in. But as I mentioned, the concepts as part of this recipe for dialing in a crushing tone are keep the gain down and then slowly turn it up to the settings that you think sounds good, but always keep it low. If you're going past noon, like right up the middle with your gain, it's probably too much. Push a hotter signal into the amp, maybe turn up the master a little bit to try to get more saturation, but don't turn up the gain, keep it down. With that, I'm gonna go ahead and dial in this tone. All right, one quick note I want to make here is now that I've turned on the Fort and Grind overdrive pedal, and given what I just mentioned about what it does to the signal, I'm going to circle back to my EQ plugin and pull down the highs a little bit because the grind is already pushing the highs quite a bit, so I don't need as much of the high end that I'm making here. And this is all just part of dialing in a tone, right? You got to adjust things, then you can circle back and make adjustments as needed or as necessary. So I'm gonna pull this down, I don't know, maybe about to only boosting up to about 3 dB. And then because I want a proper gain staging, good signal, I'm gonna bring up my level that I'm sending out of this plugin to compensate for the drop in the additive EQ on the high end. So let's see if I'm clipping here. All right, just a little bit of clipping, so I'm gonna bring that back down. All right, so that looks pretty good right there. So I'm gonna leave that, and I'm gonna continue dialing in this tone now. All right, so I have got this thing set up to where I think this sounds absolutely crushing right now, just with these settings. So I boosted up the master a little bit, and as you can see, I brought up the bass, but I've also got the pull saturation pulled here, and this kind of adds more of a scooped tone, adds a little bit more coloration or saturation to the tone, and because I'm using the grind, the Fort and Grind here, and I'm pulling out, it drops the bass drastically, plus I'm kind of EQing out some of that some of the bass in my DI signal as well. Now I can go back and add some of that bass back from the amp here, which gives me a better sounding overall bass versus having all that bass going into the amp. And then I've just kind of boosted up the mids a little bit. I've got the treble right up the middle. I think the treble is fine where it's at. Same thing with presence. And then as you can see, I've pulled back the gain to about 4 on both of these. And this, and then of course my toggles, you can see where I've got those set. But this is kind of what the tone sounds like now. Sounds absolutely crushing right there. And you can see I've got the gain pulled down, so keep the gain down. That is important. The next thing we're going to move into is talking about good external impulse responses to give you new tonal options, right? So a lot of these plugins come with really great IRs built in, but you're limited with what it comes with. In the one that you've been hearing here is the SM57 impulse response that comes built in to the Fort and Cali suite. This is a great impulse response. You heard it. It sounds crushing. It's good. But what I want is I want to experiment with some external IRs that is going to give me new tonal possibilities. And this is where you can really, really get into making big changes to your tone, and you're gonna see that with this pack that I'm using here, and this is the Christian Cola Rainbows and Chainsaws pack by Bogren Digital. I'll put a link down below in the comments or the description of the video, so look for that if you dig these tones or these IRs. But this is probably one of my favorite packs right now, and specifically this is the Chainsaws pack. These are kind of meant for some of the more extreme genres, but I absolutely love some of the tones that come out of this. It's incredible. So let's just kind of jump through some of these now, and we'll compare it to the built-in IR, and you'll see just how important having some additional IRs you can drop in is really gonna make, because it has a huge impact on your tone. All right, and so what I'm going to do now is just kind of click through some of these IRs until I land on one that I really resonate with, and that's probably where we'll stop. But you can see just how important having some good mix ready, in fact, IRs are, so that you can not only hear a good tone, but you know it's already been EQ'd and processed to be able to drop into a mix if the time comes that you're going to use this guitar tone in a mix. So here's what these sound like. All right, and so that one right there, that's kind of the tone that I was searching for here. Is it's got a good top end bite to it. You've got clear mids, but there's some good low end in there as well. And so this one I'm really resonating with. So yeah, you can obviously see how important having some good external impulse responses are. And as I said previously, I would recommend looking for some that are already pre-processed, pre-EQ'd, and mix ready, so that you know you're not only dialing in a sick tone for if you just want to sit around and play and jam, write some riffs or whatever you want to do, but when the time comes to actually start dropping this tone into a mix, you know it's going to help. It's going to sit in the mix better and require less effort to sit in a mix because these impulse responses are already processed and ready to go for a mix. All right, y'all, that is going to wrap up my recipe for a crushing metal guitar tone. I hope you liked this video. I know it was a long one. If you're still here watching, I thank you for sticking around and checking out the whole video. If you like this and you think this was helpful, maybe you learned something in this video, hit that like button down below and consider subscribing to my channel. That button is right down below as well. We'll be doing some follow-up videos related to this on dialing in a good crushing guitar tone for a mix and not just, kind of soloed like this. So if that is something that interests you, make sure you hit that bell after subscribing so that you're notified when I upload new videos. And as always, thank you for watching and thank you for your support.